Welcome to the German Climate Pavilion at COP29 in Baku. Germany. Climate solutions, fast and fair.
Good morning, everybody. So, the very early bird catches, the worm. Good to see you all. So, I welcome you on behalf of the BDI, which is the Federation of German Industries, and the German Ministry for Economy and Climate Protection here for our side event. So we want to talk today about how carbon pricing, competitiveness, and international cooperation can come together. And we will touch issues like carbon pricing in general, like CBAM, so all of the issues which are very much discussed around here at the COP as well. So we have a very distinguished panel later on, but we now start without further ado. And I would like to ask our State Secretary of the Ministry of Economy and Climate Protection, Stefan Wenzel, to give us his keynote.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to have you here in the German Pavilion early in the morning. Dear Mr. Dincbas, Mr. Lösch, dear Mr. Wilson, Mr. De Clara, Mr. Gadde, Mr. Weinreich, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, we experience the impact of climate change already today. Everybody knows something, what happens in his own country, in his own continent, or in his own region. And we are working on CO2 pricing, and CO2 pricing can make an essential contribution to internalizing the costs associated with climate change, and thus achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement in a cost-efficient manner. And that's very important, in a cost-efficient manner. It creates technology-neutral investment incentives as lower emission products and manufacturing processes become more attractive in terms of price. Generates revenues to finance complementary climate measures and social compensation. That's also a very big and important point, because we still have a lot of countries which has subsidies on fossil fuels. And that's also normally very difficult for the budget. And the CO2 price goes in another direction and is therefore very helpful. I remember the BDI initially was a little bit skeptical about the introduction of an emission trading system in Germany. However, the constructive dialogue developed over time, among others as part of the working group on emission trading as a means to combat the impacts of greenhouse gases, AGE, which was created 24 years ago by the German government. The joint organization today of this event is a sign of this fruitful cooperation. So I would like to thank the BDI, Dr. Lösch, for co-organizing this event, together. And as a member country of the European Union, Germany has 20 years of experience with emission trading systems. The so-called ETS1, Emission Trading System 1, covering large installations in the energy sector and energy-intensive industries since 2005, and is a really success story. Emissions in these sectors have almost halved since the introduction of the ETS1 system. And since the start of emission trading, concerns about carbon leakage have emerged. That's the point where we discussed a lot with our industry, because carbon leakage is an important point. And now we working with the CBAM, We introduced the CBAM as an innovative instrument to address carbon leakage risks in line with our increased climate targets. And when I say Germany, I mean also Europe, because the ETS1 is a European project. And so we are in line with our colleagues from all other European Union countries. The extent of the European Union carbon price to imports from other jurisdictions reflects the spirit of the polluter pays principle. And that was formulated in the Rio Declaration in 1992. It's creating a level playing field and simultaneously a bottom-up approach at global level. Germany has been supporting partner countries for more than 50 years in the development and the implementation of carbon pricing instruments that fit their needs and their circumstances via multilateral initiatives such as the Partnership for Market Implementation and the International Carbon Action Partnership, ICAP. And in addition, the support preparation for Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. For example, we are the SPA 6C program, which has the potential to build capacity for national CO2 pricing mechanism in developing countries. And we work together also bilateral, for example, with Turkey through the International Climate Initiative. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm looking forward to hear the panelists on how we can foster carbon pricing globally to effectively mitigate climate change. It's a very, I think, one of the most important programs we have in Germany to get ahead, to have efforts in the field of climate action. And so it's very interesting to hear your ideas and how we can go together further on. And I thank you very much for listening me.
Yeah, thank you, State Secretary Wenzel. So I well heard your note on BDI's positions, which happened before I took over on these issues. But I have to say that the core of the question BDI had was always, so companies don't have a problem with prices as long as their competitors pay the same prices. So it was always about the issue of a level playing field, and I think this is there and present until today, as we all know. Carbon leakage, investment leakage, and competitiveness have always been a very major preoccupation for policymakers and stakeholders both. The BDI has been very much involved in this discussion over the years and continues to do so. You all know that the EU has a very ambitious target. It's climate neutrality by 2050. Germany is even aiming for 2045 to be climate neutral. And of course, this has accelerated and made bigger the necessity to talk about carbon leakage and tools which could address this problem. So we had the free allocation in the European ETS, the emission trade scheme of the European Union. Of course, something due to the character of a cap and trade system is going to run out one day. And so the EU came up with the idea of a carbon border adjustment mechanism, shortly CBAM. Since then, the discussions about CBAM have not stopped. We are in a first test phase now, so there is nothing to be paid, but there has to be a lot to be reported. And to be very open, the start was very tricky. The companies had the impression that they had a lot of additional bureaucracy to do and are not sure if this is going to work. So it's on iron and steel, cement, fertilizers, aluminium and electricity, and there are already discussions going on to expand it to other sectors. So as the EU says, this is connected to our EU ETS. They say it's a climate measure. Yet there are quite a few around the globe who say, oh, this might be about trade as well. And you all have noticed that the Chinese try to put trade issues on the agenda here. So fortunately, this did not block the agenda. But if you talk to Brazilian negotiators and others, so the issue of trade and CBAM and other issues is really very present. And so I think we really have to talk about this. I would say we should put much more work and effort into looking into climate policies in the key emerging and developing economies and see how climate policies could fairly and meaningfully support low carbon trade, because this should not have negative impacts. I feel that the question of trade being combined with climate protection has some dangers, and this is what we want to talk about in the panel, which is going to take place in a few minutes. I would say that it very often has been said, no, there's no clear carbon leakage risk. There are a lot of scientific papers on this, and I hope we will get some expertise in our panel later on. But I think we have to acknowledge that it's not about taking away carbon or carbon being emitted some other place. It is really about competition. I would say that some countries are trying to gain market shares on a green technology market, on a global market, with subsidies and other things. And therefore, we have to talk about investment leakage as well. So this is what we want to discuss in our panel later. But first, I'm very glad that we have a real expert here to setting the scene for us for the panel. It's StefanoDe Clara. He's the head of Secretariat of the International Carbon Action Partnership, ICAP, and a very, very he knows a lot about the issue. Stefano, give us your insights, and then we will get to the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for the invite to be here, and thank you also for joining us for today's event. I was asked to give a really quick scene-setting presentation for the upcoming panel discussion, but State Secretary Wenzel already did that way better than I could do. So I'll try to build on that and expand a little bit on why carbon pricing, where we are at the moment with the implementation of carbon pricing globally, and how this intersect the discussion on competitiveness, carbon leakage, and international cooperation. And again, State Secretary Wenzel already made the case quite clearly for why we need carbon pricing. Just recapping what he already outlined, carbon pricing can be a really powerful policy tool that governments have at disposal for decarbonization. Also, as a note of context, ICAP, the organization I work for, is an organization that brings together more than 40 governments that jointly work on the implementation of carbon pricing policies through emission trading systems. And the discussion we're going to have is obviously at the core of our work and at the core of what the member governments of ICAP, which include Germany and many other governments, are grappling with at the moment. So carbon pricing is a really simple and powerful concept. We need to reduce CO2 emissions. So to do that, we put a price on CO2 emissions to discourage CO2 emissions and to move production practices and the overall economy towards greener substitutes and lower emitting production processes. By now, we have many decades of experience with implementation of carbon pricing globally, and we know that carbon pricing can be a really effective and efficient policy tool to reduce CO2 emissions. It is effective because it allows to meet decarbonization targets, and it is efficient because it does so at the least cost possible compared to other policies, and especially compared to other policies such as command and control policies. That is because it is a market-based policy and introduces efficiency in the decarbonization process. Today's side event is organized by BDI, and also, as we heard from the previous speaker, carbon pricing is a concept that can also work well for industry if competitiveness is preserved. Carbon pricing works quite well for industry because it is a type of policy that industry is used to deal with. Having an explicit carbon price allows businesses to incorporate this carbon price in their production practices, in investment decisions. They can internalize it in their own processes and procedures. And by doing that, they can really reflect and adapt to this regulation much better than they could do with other types of climate policies or other types of regulation. Carbon pricing also works quite well from a government perspective, because by applying a carbon price with one single policy tool, you can cover a relatively large share of your economy, which obviously reduces administrative burden both on the economy, both on the government side, but also on the side of the covered entities. And it also, by exposing large parts of the economy to one uniform carbon price, again, it introduces increased efficiency in the decarbonization effort. We have decades of experience that testify that, and if you've been watching this space, you will also know that over the last few months, there were several studies that came out reviewing the evidence that we have so far in terms of the effectiveness of carbon pricing policies, and we know that carbon pricing are making a great contribution to global decarbonization efforts. Last but not least, as it was mentioned earlier, carbon pricing policies can also raise revenues, which are also at the core of the decarbonization effort, because they can use to compensate, for example, expose the businesses, but also expose the consumers to unintended distributional impacts of carbon pricing. So where are we today with the implementation of carbon pricing policies? As of today, we have 75 carbon pricing initiatives globally, which span almost every continent. They are almost equally split between carbon taxes and emission trading systems. Carbon taxes and emission trading systems jointly cover almost 13 gigatons of CO2 emissions, which is roughly a quarter of global CO2 emissions. So overall, a quarter of the global economy is, as of today, already subject to a carbon price. And one key trend that we're seeing at the moment is that carbon pricing is becoming increasingly popular also among developing countries. If you've been observing this space, you will know that key economies such as China and Indonesia have recently introduced emission trading systems as a way to put a price on carbon, and other key emerging economies and key G20 economies are in the process of introducing carbon pricing policies. We know that India, Turkey, Brazil, Colombia, they have all announced that they are taking steps to introduce emission trading systems in the coming years. And we can really see how emission trading systems and carbon pricing policies more broadly will be at the forefront of decarbonization efforts going forward. This is a process that comes with challenges, obviously, and we do have a few. I just wanted to touch on a few and give you a bit of an overview on, from our point of view, what will be the upcoming challenges and the key trends in the carbon pricing and emission trading systems at the moment. So, especially working with governments that are implementing emission trading systems, both in terms of ICAP members and more broadly developing countries that are implementing new emission trading systems, we see that there is a lot of attention on expanding the scope of existing emission trading systems. I mean, this is a process that we see in Europe, where the European Commission is about to launch a second emission trading system to cover fuel consumption in transport and the buildings. And it's also expanding the current emission trading system to include the maritime sector. The UK is also working on expanding the scope of its emission trading system. China is also looking to expand the scope of their national emission trading system that currently only covers the power sector, but from next year will be expanded to cover industrial sectors as well. And in general, there is an effort to expand the coverage of emission trading systems, again, as a way to expand the coverage of carbon pricing and expand more and more sectors of the economy to a uniform carbon price signal. There is also, and it was mentioned before, a lot of attention on just transition and on maintaining societal support for the implementation of carbon pricing policies. This has to do with, again, shielding consumers against unintended distributional impacts of carbon pricing, but it also has to do with carbon pricing, with the carbon leakage and competitiveness. And the panel will talk more about that, and I will be saying a few more words in a second. And the last key topic that is coming up on the horizon is the net zero alignment of emission trading systems. This has to do with the potential integration of removal units in emission trading systems, for example, and it also has to do with understanding what role emission trading systems and carbon pricing can play in a net zero policy mix. Coming back to competitiveness and CBAM and concluding my remarks, I also wanted to see that obviously maintaining competitiveness is key, as the previous speaker just mentioned. We need to maintain support for these policy tools both in the covered entities and in society at large, and to a large extent that will have to do with the extent to which carbon pricing and emission trading systems can ensure that competitiveness is maintained. We know that a game changer in that sense is the implementation of the European Border Carbon Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM, and Europe will not be the only one in that effort. We already heard announcements from the UK, which intends to introduce a similar mechanism in the coming years. We know that there is interest from Canada, from the US, where border adjustment mechanisms have bipartisan support, so they're expected to go ahead even with the new administration, and for countries such as Australia in the Asia-Pacific region. And obviously, this will be a defining policy going forward. It has implications not only on competitiveness, not only on carbon leakage, but also on trade relations. And again, looking ahead, it will be key to ensure that covered entities under increasingly stringent and more ambitious carbon pricing regimes will be able to maintain their competitiveness. I'm really looking forward to the panel discussion that will delve more into this topic. With that, thank you again, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what the panelists will have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefano. This was a very compact, a very good approach here. So now I would like to ask my panel up to the stage, and I would like to start with Dr. TuğbaDincbas. She is Deputy Director at the Turkish Directorate of Climate Change. Welcome, Tuğba. Next one in line is HarikumarGadde. He is Senior Climate Change Specialist at the World Bank. I have AndrewWilson. He's the Deputy Secretary General of Policy at the International Chamber of Commerce. So, and last not least, DirkWeinreich. He's the Head of Division of Climate Legislation and Emissions Trading at the BMWK, which is the ministry who is hosting us today. So, well, so we heard a lot now from Stefano, a lot to digest, and I would, so he made very clear that carbon pricing is going to play a major role in achieving our goals. Nobody would object to this. I mean, basically, governments have three instruments. They can put a price on something, they can command and control, and they can give out subsidies. Basically, this is the set of instruments governments have. So my first question to our group here is, so how do you see the role of carbon pricing in general in the mix of the policy mix to transition into net zero economy? And Tuğba, I would start with you.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation and giving the opportunity to contribute to this important topic. As you know, we have a big emission gap for 2035 to limit the global warming with 1 degree Celsius. It's almost 55%, and carbon pricing plays a critical role in addressing this implementation gap, and we also, as Turkey, see this as an opportunity also. A decade ago only carbon pricing covered perhaps 7% of the global emission, and nowadays it covers almost a quarter of the emissions, and it increases. So when we come to the Turkey, we have a net zero target for 2053, and we announced our long-term strategy for 2053 just in the first day of the COP29, and we want to establish and implement a national emission trading system in the country starting the next year. So we drafted our climate law, and it's now in the parliament, and after the discussions and the law is enacted, we will start implementation of ETS. ETS is emission trading system, or carbon pricing issues are also very important to achieve our NDC target and also net zero target. So actually this is very crucial also for our country as a developing emerging economy. So this is the first part of
Thank you. Andrew, ICC is the main business observer here at the COP. So what is your take on the role of carbon pricing in the policy mix?
Thank you so much, and thank you for the opportunity to join you for what is, I think, a very, very important discussion. Just before I answer the question, I think we've seen a lot of panels, a lot of discussions at this COP on raising ambition, going faster and further in terms of decarbonizing the economy, but we fully support that. Let me be clear, we have a high level of ambition as ICC, aligned with net zero by 2050. But we also think it's important that there's a discussion of the efficacy of the instruments used to get us there. And I think that sometimes is a missing dimension of what we hear at COPs and in other fora. So thank you to you and the BDI for convening what I think is a very, very important discussion. As ICC, we firmly have a preference for market-based mechanisms. So the three pathways: carbon pricing, subsidies, but certainly not command and control. Our view practically is there are very few economies that can follow the US path of providing vast subsidies, as is the case with the IRA, to enable the transition. So carbon pricing clearly has a key role to play. I think what's important, though, is that we have some nuance in this debate. I think it's too easy just to point to carbon pricing as the solution. Clearly, it's not. Our view is the design of the instruments needs to be very, very carefully calibrated, and we've put out a number of principles and best practices over the past few years to help guide policymakers based on the business experience navigating the existing 75+ carbon pricing, whether it's cap and trade or taxation schemes that are out there. And that experience is mixed. So clearly there's some scope to improve how those instruments are calibrated. I think the other thing is that is absolutely key from the experience of members across our network is if you are going to introduce a carbon price of some kind, how does it intersect with other domestic policy signals? So I think your state secretary very rightly pointed to subsidies on fossil fuels. But often we see mixed signals being sent to the economy, which we think ultimately undermines the effectiveness of the instruments. And then the other thing is we think very clearly, and I think this is the key message from ICC, if governments are going to use carbon pricing, it really has to be focused on driving decarbonization. It can't be a tool to try and achieve other policy aims, including raising government revenues. So design is vital, consistency with the broader policy ecosystem is absolutely crucial, and then properly targeted measures, not trying to achieve other objectives. It has to be a square focus on decarbonization.
Thank you, Andrew. So Dirk, you are on the daily forefront of practicing carbon pricing in Germany. So it's the division of climate legislation and emissions trading. So from your long experience, so how would you describe the role carbon pricing is playing versus other things like command and control and subsidizing?
Okay, thank you very much. I'm glad to be here on this interesting panel and meaningful panel. And also, let me say, I'm pleased that we can have a joint panel organized together with the BDI. This is in the spirit of cooperation that we have, meanwhile, on pricing in Germany. My State Secretary Stefan Wenzel mentioned in the beginning that carbon pricing was maybe in the beginning not perceived so positive by industry. But now we cooperate very much on that, and this is great. On the question, carbon pricing is clearly, in our view, maybe if not the only, but a very important instrument to guarantee the transition to low carbon, to net zero. In the end, it gives investment incentives for companies and for households to buy low emission products in the case of households, or to install innovative production processes and become more cost efficient. In this way. So it is, as I said, maybe not the only measure. To reach Paris targets, you might also need a broad policy mix, including both also regulatory measures and also targeted support programs. In the case of industry, for instance, if you are about to develop really jumping new technologies, like in the steel sector, you need also support. This is a great risk that industries enters, and of course then this has to also to be a bit financed or guaranteed from the state side, what we do with specific treaties. But coming back to emissions trading, especially with over 20 years now of experience in the EU, with our ETS1 on energy and industry, and also in Germany recently on our national fuel emissions trading system on households and smaller industries and transport. You can say an emissions trading system as a specific form of carbon pricing guarantees the achievement of quantified targets, and this is what the climate protection is all about. So for policy, it should be an instrument of choice. You can guarantee your goals. And in addition, this was mentioned often, so I will be short on that. Pricing generates revenues, and huge revenues, in our case here in the EU and Germany, that you can use to address the economic impacts HolgerLösch addressed already, but also in the case of extending emissions trading to public households and transport, also the impacts on the citizens that are clearly always sensitive issues for politicians. So, yeah, let me end on the question, like quoting a recent study that showed that those countries who have pricing systems in place, they develop relatively more successful in achieving their goals towards net zero. And this shows that I believe, and we believe in the German government, that without carbon pricing, you would not have a chance to come to net zero. Thank you.
Harikuma, I'm very glad that we have the World Bank here, and so my question would be from a bank perspective, of course, a market price or a market-based system, I would assume is your favorite option. So, but how do you look at from the experience of the World Bank at this mix of instruments and the role of carbon pricing? Yeah, it's on. It's on.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation, first of all. So I think a lot been already said about what the role of the carbon pricing has been. So when we work mostly with, of course, developing countries through the Partnership for Market Implementation program. We are working with some 30+ countries right now. I mean, different countries have a different understanding of what role carbon pricing plays. Yes, we all know that we have more than 2 decades of experience, mostly in the Western world. So how do we actually translate those experiences into the developing country context? So recently we published 2 reports, one to specifically look into the political economy, which is, of course, major issue in many of these countries that we work, and also when applying the carbon pricing in sector like, for example, power sector. I mean, it's like, no, yeah, it is, of course, highly successful in developed world, but given that in many of the countries in the developing world, so they are highly regulated. So adopting the same principles and the same approaches might not work in this one. So how do we actually convince the political leaders there? I mean, it's like in the role of the carbon pricing is one of the biggest challenges. So what alternatives actually, for example, the industry has, like when you introduce a carbon pricing, so that there are sufficient incentives for them to reduce the emissions. So that is basically where countries are trying to understand what policies works. As Dirk mentioned, of course, carbon pricing alone won't be do the trick, of course, because then policymakers needs to understand the interactions with other existing policies. So how do we actually then they understand better where the levers are for the carbon pricing to work. Yes, we can talk about the revenues that the carbon pricing can rise, and then how those revenues could be utilized, and etc. And then again, there not a successful examples to quote that one like this how actually, because many of the countries also have a debt issues, and then they wanted to, of course, these carbon revenues to go to the general budget, but not to earmark it for specific purposes. So how actually we deal with all these complications, I think, is one of the key challenges that we face in many of the countries that we work. Yes, at the broader level, there is a convincing argument that carbon pricing work, but operationalizing that into the practice is what many of the countries that are facing. So I think we all collectively needs to improve the narrative on what the role actually this plays in developing countries, so that they better understand the role of the carbon policies. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, this is perfect for the next round of question I would ask. So we've heard that 25% and 75 carbon systems. I hear this very often. I would say of the 75% not being in, there are a few percent which are really worrying me, like the United States or others. So it's good that we see a lot of Canadian provinces having a carbon pricing system and so on. But from and I'm clearly speaking from a industry perspective now. So what worries us is that major players on the global competition scheme are not part of this, and it's not about not being part of this. It's about how the quality of the pricing system is. Of course, you can put a pricing system. We all know how this works. You can front load, back load. You can put a maximum price and a minimum price and whatever. So there are a lot of measures how you can make it work for your needs. And so my next question would be, and Harikuma, you already mentioned a bit of it. So where do you see the major hurdles for countries, either industrialized countries or developing countries, to apply a really working carbon pricing system?
Yeah, thanks again. So as touched upon, so I think one of the challenges at least we face is that how do we empirically and show to these countries that yes, carbon pricing reduces emissions. Of course, we have examples in the EU, you have UK, and even in the Chinese during their pilot scheme, they all of course reduce the emissions. So can we actually, of course, develop some kind of a simple tools, measures that are, of course, useful for countries so that they can use to see how actually these carbon pricing can actually help them to reduce emissions. So that's one of the challenges that, of course, we are looking into very seriously about that part. And then, of course, the distributional impacts. Of course, obviously, we all know that is the one big challenge for the country. So again, so communication of the benefits of the carbon pricing to various stakeholders in the economy is one thing. I mean, that's basically where many of the developing countries lack. For example, Turkey, under the Partnership for Market Readiness program, of course, they have developed a very well communication campaign. I mean, it's how basically carbon pricing benefits the economy. But I think those things needs to be replicated in many of the countries. I mean, so many countries lack how do we actually communicate the benefits to the real stakeholders. It's not, of course, the backdoor channels and then how actually they go in and introduce that thing. Because in many instances, of course, the objective could be just to raise the revenues. Because of the Ministry of Finance thinks that this could be one of the options to do this thing. But of course, how actually they handle the impacts on the low-income households in these countries. I mean, that's one of the biggest challenges that they have. And then, of course, the international cooperation. I think that's basically where I see a lot of role right now. I mean, for example, the EU's task force on the diplomacy is one such a way to look into that thing. And then, of course, the PMI is one thing that, of course, we're trying to help countries to bring the experiences from other countries so that, of course, we all learn from not just only north-south, but also from south to south. So that's basically one thing. I think so. As I think ICC mentioned, I mean, it's how do we ensure that the pricing is well designed, of course, obviously, and then how it is a socially inclusive, and then of course also it facilitates the international cooperation. I think these are the three main things that I think are essential for us to work with all the developing countries to introduce carbon pricing.
Thank you, Andrew. So your global membership, if you talk to them about carbon pricing, what do those say who don't have it? Why they don't have it?
It's a very good question. We've never asked them that, I don't think. Look, from our perspective, we're very clear that for global climate action to be effective, we need to see greater convergence in the use of carbon pricing mechanisms. I think a couple of years ago, the UK insurer, Aviva, did some pretty useful modeling, looking at what kind of carbon price do you need globally if you want to achieve net zero by 2050. And I think their estimate was a carbon price of something in the region of $150 per ton. So double almost what we're at in the European Union right now, 30 times the current price level in China. From our perspective, we need to have a serious conversation about how do we start to get to meaningful prices in all economies, or as many economies as possible, and how do we start to see greater convergence. And I think the point around capacity building, positive engagement to give governments the technical support they need, but also the confidence to act is absolutely vital. And I think there's an important debate there about how do you recycle revenues in a way that potentially mitigates competitiveness effects, and also, as you rightly said, the impact on households.
Tuğba, so, I mean, Turkey is thinking about it, and so looking at the discussion in your country, what were the main things which made you a problem walking forward to going to a carbon pricing system?
Thank you. Actually, there are many different critical topics when a government wants to introduce a carbon pricing system. And one is, of course, economy, global economy. You know, the energy prices, the inflation rate, the fluctuations of the ETS prices in the EU, and etc. These are quite concerning, and these also create concern for giving long-term signal for the investors, for the technology developers, for the industry, and etc. Another issue that we have to think is the carbon leakage, of course. In the second part, I think we will discuss it, but it's also a big concern, and we have to also manage this issue. Another problem is, of course, the success of carbon pricing is an issue of political economy, as you said, and we have to think much more broadly. We have to think on just transition issues. We have to assist the low-income households, and etc., etc. And when we come to the political support, of course, without it, it will not successful. But as we know, 24% of global emissions are covered now. And when we add the countries like Turkey want to introduce or plan to introduce carbon pricing, then we achieve only 30% of the global emissions. And it's, of course, not enough. And scale of carbon pricing remains inconsistent with the national and international targets, especially Paris Agreement targets. So, and of course, there are differences between countries in terms of coverage, in terms of price, and etc. And it's also another problem that we have to think during the design and implementation process of the ETS. The last important issue is international collaboration. We believe that without it, it's not possible to achieve net zero for the world. And we have to ensure that major emitter countries enhance carbon pricing, and international collaboration is very crucial in this issue. And we have to provide assistance to developing countries. For example, we are working with Germany, with World Bank, with AFD, with France, and etc. So we don't have any experience on emission trading system or CDM and etc. etc. So international collaboration, sharing experiences, and also increasing capacity of the public and private sector is also crucial. So last issue, perhaps we will discuss in the coming years, negotiating minimum carbon pricing among major global players will perhaps encourage countries to engage in carbon pricing much more better.
Thank you. So Dirk, you and the ministry in Germany and Europe have been clearly the front runners in setting up still the most comprehensive carbon pricing system on the globe. So I assume that you have a lot of conversations with others who are thinking about this, who are perhaps not thinking about this. So could you briefly describe what the main questions are other countries are asking you when you are in conversations about carbon pricing?
Okay, thank you very much. And I must say there are various issues that could be should be mentioned under this question. The first thing is on a more political level. Countries who think about introducing carbon pricing, they might think about or fear for the adverse economic and social aspects or impacts, you should say. That, of course, can be addressed, but in the beginning, this is also maybe it seems to be a risk. Yeah? As I said in the beginning, especially ETS, guaranteeing to fulfill goals is a quite rigid system. It's a successful but also a rigid system. It needs a rigid system. And therefore, this could raise these fears. Especially if you have a cap, you could also fear for that you could not grow as an economy anymore. But also there, it must be clear there are ways to overcome this. You can reserve specific parts of a cap for new entrants. Just to mention one way, there are other ways to address these. And as I'm also co-chair of ICAP, I can tell you that the different regions in ICAP, they solve this problem differently, without leaving the general perspective of having a cap and trade system. On the effects, our experience is that maybe it's very important if you introduce such a system that you have a meaningful engagement with all the various stakeholder groups and those groups who would be affected by this. We in Germany, for instance, we have a permanent stakeholder consultation like the working group for emissions trading, which I have the honor to chair. We discuss every problems that arise there. Pilot phases can also be very helpful to build up MRV systems and provide information that enables the improvement and the refinement of ETS. And yeah, of course, a second set of questions could also be it's setting up especially an ETS system is quite a complex process. TuğbaDincbas mentioned that, and you have to at least guarantee that you have a robust institutional, regulatory and procedural framework in place, and this is of course a challenge. But as it was mentioned, there are many fora, and some of them are here. in the PMI, there's help that you can get. We have in Germany, we have a specific capacity building program to support states who consider introducing ETS. Also a specific program with Turkey. And we have ICAP, as I mentioned, to address for those who want to think about introducing ETS, where they can get help from the very well-skilled secretariat and also other states. So these questions can be addressed. And to mention lastly, sometimes there might also be window of opportunity to address your very first question when you on this round, why do not so many states come in? Sometimes it needs an instrument maybe like the CBAM who motivates a bit, because it's clear that all the states who are addressed by the CBAM, affected by the CBAM, might think in the end, would they pay the price at the border to the EU, or would they have an own pricing system to get revenues at their home? And maybe I stop with that. Thank you.
Yeah, or maybe think about how to outrun CBAM. But this is a later discussion we have. Let's raise complexity a little bit. So we've seen a lot of discussions here on Article 6. We are, with climate neutrality as a goal, we will have to look at a lot of negative emissions necessary in the future. And of course, we have voluntary carbon markets. So my question, is there a way to implement those aspects into existing carbon pricing system? And Hariku, I would ask you.
Yeah, thanks. So use of offsets into the carbon pricing instruments is not a new concept. I think almost every country that we are working right now is considering developing their domestic crediting markets for two reasons. One, of course, obviously to help the entities that are covered by the carbon pricing, but also to sell these credits to international market, especially on the Article 6. But I think the challenge is, of course, obviously, the enabling environment that countries needs to set domestically. So because many of these countries actually lack the capacity to introduce such kind of a thing. And then in cases like, for example, South Africa, and then now for the Chile, and then many countries in Latin America, and also East Asia Pacific, so they're all actually looking into the role of the offsets into their pricing. So not every country is, of course, obviously developing their own systems from scratch, but of course relying on the existing ones, be it like, recognizing the credits generated by, for example, voluntary standards, or by hopefully Article 6 in the future. So they are very positive on that one, but I think understanding how much the role that offsets will play, for every system has a certain restrictions on, say, up to 5% or 10%, and then there are few countries, of course, that have unlimited acceptance of those credits. So I think we are looking into helping countries to establish that enabling environment at the local level, so that they identify the sectors that, of course, could have a scalability potential, but of course also a potential to bring additional revenues through sale of the credits. So that's how actually we are looking into that thing. So another thing, of course, countries are also looking into, especially where they wanted to sell these credits, is the legal nature of these carbon credits, which is, of course, is not been considered fully so far right now, because it has implications on how the offsets would be considered as be it as a commodity or a security, and then what the tax implications that it will have. And so that is the one thing that is quite fast emerging in many of the countries that we are working. But I think the bottom line is that every country that we work is looking for some kind of allowing offsets into the scheme. So that means there is efficiency, there's a flexibility, there is a scalability, and then maybe that perhaps one option to also tackle the hard-to-abate sectors, basically to start with, by allowing these offsets. I'll stop here.
Andrew, the business community is looking at Article 6 and the offset issues very closely. So what is your take on that?
So I think this is a very, very important question, because I think we're at a moment in time where we see many companies within our global network who have made very ambitious climate commitments aligned with 1.5 degrees, struggling to meet those commitments, at least in the near term, and certainly when it comes to Scope 3 commitments, or Scope 3 emissions. Our view is that there needs to be a very significant rebalancing of the discussion around the use of voluntary carbon markets, and I'm avoiding intentionally the word offsets. Earlier last week, I heard the Secretary General speaking at an event on climate accountability, where he referred to voluntary carbon markets as, and I quote, dubious. And I think that kind of captures a certain purist mentality towards the use of voluntary markets. And I think we really do, as industry, need to rebalance that discussion. They clearly have an important role to play in enabling companies to meet their voluntary commitments, but also their regulatory commitments. And I think if we close that market down, we should acknowledge that we're closing down an avenue to finance projects that most likely would not happen otherwise in a traditional market setting. So at a COP where we're talking about how do we raise the billions and trillions needed to speed decarbonization and build climate resilience, I think we need to recognize that voluntary carbon markets are a tool we can use to do that. And we shouldn't obviously elide or skim over the issues around governance of the market that we've seen. There have been issues with hot air credits, greenwashing, etc. Those issues are real. They need to be addressed. I think VCMI and ICVCM, two very confusing acronyms, are on the way to doing that. There's clearly a role for national regulation around the use and also governance of voluntary markets. But I think if we can get the governance right, if we can change the dialogue and the kind of narrative and perception of voluntary markets, then they can play a very, very important role on the compliance side, but also critically from our perspective, mobilizing finance to actually enable emissions reductions, including in supply chains. And I think that is very important. And we've also seen some very interesting work emerging from a number of academics, including at Harvard, which suggests that voluntary carbon credits could actually play a very interesting role in enabling compliance with CBAM from an exporter perspective. So I think we need to be open-minded, we need to get the governance right, but if we start with a very purist mindset of anything that isn't direct action by companies, anything that looks like a voluntary carbon credit or an offset is dubious, then I think we're storing up a big problem and we're missing a huge opportunity to mobilize the finance that is so desperately needed.
Thank you, Andrew. TuğbaDincbas, so is Turkey looking at those voluntary carbon markets, Article 6, so is this part of your equation?
Yeah. Actually, Turkey is very effective in the voluntary carbon market, and there are many credits in the country. But of course, it is this issue should be aligned with our NDC target and projections and ETS design and etc. So we are now working on this issue, how we will handle this offset process, and also what we will do under Article 6, 6.2 or 6.4 and etc. But the issue is, it's very clear that integration of offsets and removals to in carbon pricing instruments increases the cost effectiveness, increases the investments, increases the international cooperation, increases the mitigation potential of the hard-to-abate sectors, especially technology-intense sectors like carbon capture and storage and etc. So it's very crucial. It also creates co-benefits like jobs, new industries, better land management, and etc. And also there are natural-based solutions that we are very keen to implement, and these are a very good way of doing this. But at the end, of course, it's a decision of the government, and they will decide it, we will decide it. However, when we focus to the Paris Agreement's targets, we can consider that offsets and removals as tools for decarbonization and for achieving net zero. This is the clear.
Thank you, TuğbaDincbas. So, Dirk, the EU seems to be, if you follow the discussions on all of this here at the COP, so the EU seems to be, or as some other negotiator put it, to have a flexibility issue. So the EU seems to be very careful with this. Perhaps just a few words on how you see this, and if you can understand that the EU is a bit inflexible.
Thank you very much. And just to stress in the beginning, we see that offsetting emissions is a very important tool to develop carbon markets. But of course, once we have a very developed carbon market system as the ETS, we have made our experiences with letting in offsets. You know that. Offsetting can help you to mitigate the burden under a cap and trade system. But of course, it also is always something which inflates the cap. And when we've had no market stability reserve in place in former times and got could not address the impacts of the financial and production crisis, then this was a severe problem in the EU. Therefore, we are careful. But this does not mean, firstly, we wish the Article 6 negotiations here the full success now. It's important that we get this done. And secondly, we would not exclude using any offsets also in the context of the ETS in the future, because we have to see, but we have to see some things. Offsetting emissions would, in the end, allow maybe to help others to come more close to the net zero goal, but it should not deter us from our clear goals that we have in the EU. So this is the problem. So emissions offsets might not be the first instrument of our choice. But on the question of negative emissions, as this was also mentioned, this might be different in the end, because it's quite clear our very ambitious emissions trading cap in the ETS1, energy and industry, is coming to an end soon. And maybe at that time we are still not there where we still have some residual emissions. Of course, you can say then these have to be all efforts have to be done to mitigate this and also to use CCS technologies. But nevertheless, in the end, we might need negative emissions to come to net zero, and we need to incentivize this early. And therefore, it might also be an option to think about some system that connects also with a demand system like the ETS. I am a bit vague on this because this topic is very closely investigated at the moment, but it's clear that we have to address the problem of negative emissions and investment and incentives for those negative emissions. And on the other hand, we also, of course, have to see that the ETS cap is coming to zero quite soon. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have another like 15 minutes left now, and I would go into the final round, which is on carbon leakage and its dangers and how CBAM could help with that. And I would perhaps start with sort of a lightning round, perhaps a very short. Do you think that carbon leakage is an issue, and perhaps 2 or 3 examples why you think it is an issue? Because this is heavily debated. We have a lot of economists who say there is no such thing as carbon leakage. And Andrew, I would like to start with you on that.
Great question, a very difficult question. I think reading the academic literature on this is almost a recipe to get a migraine, because you look at the ex-ante research and it says high theoretical risk, very high theoretical risk. And then you look at some of the ex-post analysis and it's all over the place, right? What we hear quite clearly is sectors with relatively high emissions intensity in Europe, but also more broadly in OECD economies, clearly feel exposed to the risk of carbon leakage in an environment where there's a high level of international trade and very significant asymmetries in carbon prices. And we're very alert to the fact that if Europe, the UK, and others go towards an ever higher carbon price, towards the $160 I mentioned earlier as a kind of target, then that risk, at least theoretically, seems to be more pronounced. So I think we have to accept that the jury is out in terms of the evidence, or in terms of the evidence as to the scale of the problem, but there is a perceived risk within industry that will create inevitable political pressures for the kind of action we've seen with CBAM in the EU.
Dirk, is there such thing?
There's clearly a risk of carbon leakage. There should not be doubt about it. Empirical studies, of course, they show that might be in the past there was not so much evidence that this risk also turned to be reality. But that was due to, in our thinking, it was due to 2 facts. First, carbon prices were quite low in the beginning, also in the EU with all the effects I mentioned earlier. And also secondly, from the beginning on, we did not introduce the ETS without addressing the carbon leakage risk from the beginning on via cost-free allocation. And so we believe this is still maybe the reason why you don't see so much realized risk. But in the future, as prices will go up, if our caps are tightened, and if even maybe measures like cost-free allocation have to be phased out, then this risk clearly will rise. And we need, and this leads maybe to your last question, we need to think about other instruments.
Harikuma.
Yes, I think with asymmetric ambition, which is reflected in the coverage and then prices and etc. I think every country takes leakage as a big concern. I mean, it's like so I think for me, the challenge is not, of course, how we address the leakage, but I think how actually we transform this opportunity into a the global cooperation and then alignment with the ambition that is needed. Of course, countries need, again, I wanted to emphasize again and again in the developing countries context, countries need a lot of help in terms of understanding, like, how actually it impacts them, which is not actually very obvious in many of the countries. So how actually we all collectively work towards actually helping them to understand and then devise the plans accordingly.
Thank you. TuğbaDincbas, you mentioned the word carbon leakage already, so do you see this as a... Oh, sorry for the joyous party outside.
Yeah, actually, it's very clear that the countries like Turkey will face with a big carbon leakage issue, and we have also already conducted a study on this within different carbon prices of the trade sectors, especially energy and emission intensive sectors, and the result shows that in every sector, iron, steel, cement, glass, ceramics, and etc., we have carbon leakage risk at a very high level. So this is the first, perhaps one of the most important topics that we have to deal and we have to manage. And it is also very closely related with the CBAM, actually, with your actual second question. I will also touch this in the second round. But there are many things that we have to do, and we have to manage this risk because it's not only a climate change issue, it's an economic issue, it affects almost every aspect of the economy.
So Europe tries to do something against carbon leakage, and they created CBAM. So it's sounding very good. As you might have taken away from my initial input, so we have quite a few doubts. I will not name them all, but it's clearly an experiment. So it's the largest emission trade scheme in the world, the largest carbon price system, now trying to set up a system to make others pay for emissions they have not priced in their countries. So my question for the last round now is, so what is your expectation? What do you think about the concept of the CBAM, and how do you think the rest of the world is going to react to this? And Harikuma, I would start with you again.
Yeah, thanks. I think CBAM is a bold step towards addressing this leakage issue. So in order to make it very effective, I think we need to see how actually it combines with the overall policy package within these countries. So one of the challenges, at least the countries looking into, is I think someone mentioned the strengthening the MRV systems in these countries. I mean, because many of the countries that we work, so they lack actually the sophisticated MRV systems, which is of course very essential basically to work on these things. So right now the bank is looking into assessing the MRV systems in all the countries that we are working to see how compatible actually they are meeting into the different requirements under the CBAM. So that is, I think, very, very crucial. I think that we need to look into. I mean, there are, of course, some opportunities like carbon pricing diplomacy is one thing, definitely, I think, and then the, of course, there are issues related to the trade, competitiveness, and etc. But I think countries well aware of that thing, and then they are all looking like Turkey also did some kind of an assessment, and then many in the East Asia and Pacific are looking into what the impacts of the CBAM is on different sectors. Of course, bank also developed the risk index actually to help countries to understand how much risk actually they profile. With all these things, I think we hope that countries will get prepared for that one, because it is driving actually some action in many of the developing countries to get prepared for addressing the CBAM issues. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. Dirk, I know that the EU and the German government have high esteem for CBAM. And but do you fear things like circumvention and retaliation? Is this something where you are looking into? Because this is clearly, and if I sum up my conversations over the last few days, there's quite an aggressive subtone in some countries, especially on the question, is this a trade measure or is it a climate measure?
Indeed, as you said, CBAM is a kind of an experiment. That's we have to say, but we feel that's an experiment that is without choice for us as the EU, as we have such an ambitious ETS system now, where we doubled the declining rate of our cap only in the ETS 1. And so we will not have enough budget to continue with giving out free allowances in some years. And so we tried to do this introduction smoothly with a pilot phase of 3 years when nobody has to pay, but everybody has to report, where we also, together with the Commission, check whether the system can work, whether the people get the data from the foreign producers, which is a problem. Nothing to say on that. We have many things still to check whether they work. But there are provisions in place, reviews before we come to the phase of operating system, CBAM at the border. That means in 2026, where you have to pay for the embedded emissions. And so we are confident that we can address most of the issues that you can see. To come to this discussion that we hear here in the COP a bit, if you allow, we want to stress that CBAM is a fair mechanism. It's not a pure unilateral putting a burden to others. It's a mechanism which fulfills a bit, as Stefan Wenzel pointed out, the polluter pays principle. It introduces a price that our producers in the EU already pay under an ETS also to those who import into our internal market. There's no question of a discrimination. And by the way, it's also, some people here said that the victims pay. It is the European consumers who pay the price in the end, because importers and our producers, they pass it to the consumer. So it's not a question of unfairness. And we try also to be fair. We recognize foreign pricing, yeah? And also we recognize efforts other than prices in other states by giving the possibility to use own data, and that means then all those efforts and progress that has been made in foreign countries can be reflected in the lower embedded emissions in a product. So we feel it is a means which is an experiment, nothing to say on that. It is still a lot to be done, but we think we introduce it smoothly. It is gradually phasing out free allocation and gradually phasing into the CBAM. So the problem of higher prices at the border will not occur before 2029. So we still have some time. Thank you.
Thank you. TuğbaDincbas, I mean, Turkey has a very special relationship with Europe. It's part of Europe, some part of Turkey, and a high trade capacity with Europe. So how is CBAM perceived in Turkey?
Thank you. First of all, let me start with the numbers. 42% of our total export, of course, CBAM covered sectors export is to EU, and it's more than $10 billion per year. So we are a very important partner of EU, and EU is also very important from our side. Of course, we have run studies, models, and etc. to see the effect of CBAM on our economy and our industry, and etc. And it will totally affect our trade and our industry. The issue is here what we can do. First of all, decarbonization of industry sector is not easy as electricity sector. The finance need, the technological need, the time you need is totally different. So there are some issues that countries has also to focus to manage the CBAM issue. First of all, by implementing ETS system, which driver is also CBAM, because after CBAM we were very clear to establish an ETS system in the country. We will use the revenues of the ETS system to decarbonize our industry sector. Of course, it's a must. Without it, it's not possible. The other issue is free allocation or allowances. We know that EU will gradually phase down the free allowances starting from 2026. And of course, a country starting the new emission trading system next year, we will start the pilot phase. We will take the free allocation into consideration, and we will also to align or think this percentages with the CBAM and etc. And of course, for the countries, not for the Turkey, of course, at the moment, imposing carbon costs on important goods helps also discourages companies from relocating production. And international cooperation is key here, as in almost all other the issues, because we can only manage this leakage issue with international collaboration, with setting standards, with discussing the prices, with technology and finance collaboration issues, and etc. So we have also served the industry, the related technology and finance also. And it's also critical to adjust CBAM, but as I know, because this year the CBAM reporting process started, most of our countries have reported to EU for the CBAM, and the percentage is quite hard. So we are trying to support our industry and to increase the capacity of for reporting, for implementation, for decarbonizing, and also implementation of ETS. And there is a big movement in the country because our industry is very proactive. So, for example, in this COP, we have more than 1,000 industry stakeholders coming from the industry, and they are very, very proactive and eager on this issue. So we will see, but it will not so easy to manage this process in the coming years. Of course, it's very clear.
Yeah, so I would give the last word to Andrew now, because I mean you are the International Chamber of Commerce, so you're a global organization, and so I would be very interested from a global perspective how ICC is looking on CBAM, its concept, and perhaps its perception in the rest of your membership, the non-European membership.
Well, look, I think if CBAM is an experiment, then I sincerely hope that the scientists realize that there's a problem inside and outside the laboratory. And to be very blunt, apologies, in 15 years working at ICC on a variety of complex, sometimes contentious policy issues, I've never seen a comparable level of concern within our membership and with many of the governments we work with in relation to this particular regulation. And I know it is pioneering, I know it's a step in the dark, but I think there's a risk that the road to hell is paved with good intentions here. And there are two things that we desperately think need to be considered. The first is, how do we enable companies to comply with this in a relatively smooth way? There are issues with data availability, as you rightly say. Those will not necessarily be easy to address, but we think there needs to be a proper dialogue with industry to look at how we can start to look at what data can be furnished when you're talking about complex, multi-level supply chains. There are issues around the geographical scope, there are issues around the de minimis threshold. I could go on for 2 hours on this, but there are many practical issues that we think requires an open discussion with industry and a constructive discussion with industry to address, and hopefully that can be done. But from our perspective, there's also a broader issue, which is the reaction that this has provoked from a whole host of developing and emerging economies. I hear entirely what you say about the European consumer being the one that ultimately or theoretically bears the cost. But we know from analysis, empirical analysis of other tariff measures, costs are also passed down supply chains. And the biggest concern we hear is of SMEs being knocked out of supply chains that are an essential lifeline to them and their local economies, because they won't be able to comply or they won't be able to bear the costs. And I think the European Union sends a very dangerous signal on this when it says, on the one hand, we are the most open economy in the world to least developed economies, but hey, you're going to be within the scope of CBAM. Surely that needs to be addressed. And then the second concern we have, and I'll leave my points there, is we're now in a world where the UK is looking at introducing its own border adjustment mechanism. Ministers have been talking here about the key question being, how far do we align with the EU? How far do we go our own way? Australia is looking at something. New Zealand, there's, I think, credible reports the US will look at doing something, even though it doesn't have a domestic carbon price. We could be in a world similar to where we're at with carbon pricing, where we have a patchwork of border adjustment mechanisms with different calculation requirements, different compliance requirements, and that will significantly accentuate the problem companies are already facing with one very well-intentioned scheme. And there is a real risk, if we don't get this right, of fragmenting the trading system and undermining the cooperation that is needed here to tackle climate change. That's why we made a call just a few weeks ago for a multilateral dialogue through whatever institutional process, the UNFCCC, the WTO, the OECD, elsewhere, it doesn't matter to us, a multilateral dialogue to agree common principles on the design, use, and implementation of border adjustments. And absent of that, I think we are heading in a very dangerous direction, even though the intentions are good, where there will be significant economic dislocation. Many economies will feel that their own efforts to tackle climate change and develop their economies at the same time are being undermined by the West. And I think we need to be honest about that risk, and we need to find a way to deal with it. And to us, the most important thing is that we have some kind of open, multilateral process to agree on common standards, common rules, and common design.
Thank you, Andrew. So we are finished with our time. I will not repeat everything we said. I think it was very clear that, it's absolutely clear that carbon pricing is a major instrument and probably one of the most important instruments to reach our climate goals. We see that, of course, there is still a not existing complete global level playing field, which has to be addressed. It would make a lot of things easier. And what I have taken away from the discussion is the need for stronger global cooperation, multilateral cooperation, and working together to make these systems more efficient, easier to apply, and acceptable for all. And so I will not sum up the the CBAM discussion because I'm a bit biased on that, but I think we will, there is a lot to discuss in the next years, and I hope that all of the policymakers are taking the opportunity to listen to some of the arguments which have been raised here and to find a system which is really fit for all our purposes, competitiveness and climate change. So with that, I thank my panel. Thank you very much. I apologize for the choir outside. So it was a bit hard to understand it sometimes up here. And so all the best for the remaining days at the COP. Thank you.
Welcome to the German Climate Pavilion at COP29 in Baku. Germany. Climate solutions, fast and fair.